pray that the words of my mouth and the thoughts and meditations of all of our hearts are acceptable to you, gracious God of abundance, now and always. Amen. So today's story is actually the centerpiece from the scriptures that Jed talked about last week. The disciples have just returned from a mission trip, and they are exhausted. They are tired, they are excited, but they are drained. And Jesus says to them, you need a rest. You need a rest. Come away with me to a deserted place to take care of yourself as much as you have been taking care of others. I imagine that there are folks here that need to hear those words as well. If not today, then at some point as well. Come away with me to a deserted place and take care of yourself as much as you've taken care of others. There are those returned from the mission trip, the youth leaders, the volunteers who need to hear these words. There are caregivers taking care of loved ones who need to hear these words. There are moms and dads of active children that need to hear those words. There are retirees who are volunteering and as busy now as they ever have been who need to hear these words. There's nurses and doctors and there's teachers and there's office workers and there's day laborers who need to hear these words. Come away with me and get some rest. Rest for your soul, rest for your body. And when I hear this, I'm reminded of a poem by Robert Burns, To a Mouse, many years ago. The best laid schemes o' mice and men ganged off to gley. If you're not familiar with Old English. The best laid plans often go astray. And that's what happened in this story. Jesus has plans to go away and to give his disciples some rest, some quiet and some wilderness, but they get swamped. This time it's not by the sea in this part of the story that swamps them, but it's people. The text says that people saw Jesus and his disciples getting in the boat and heading across the lake, and without cell phones or text messages, or the word spread. And people from all around the towns hurried to the lake and arrived there ahead of them. I suspect that Jesus and his friends in the boat, who were headed off on their staff retreat, could see this movement taking place, this swarm of activity on the shore. But it wasn't a swarm of ants, it was people. Perhaps they scanned the horizon looking to see if there was another place that they could go ashore. But the people were coming to the shoreline by the thousands. They were waiting, they were hungry, they were eager. So the text says Jesus came ashore and saw the crowd and had compassion, and he taught them. This was a long day. They had already had a long day. They were looking for some respite care. They were tired, and the day just got a whole lot longer as he had compassion on them and he began to teach them. And so by the time the sun is setting, the disciples are tired. There are no convenience stores, no big box stores, no pop-up food trucks. They're tired, they're hungry, a lot of hungry people. So they say to Jesus, "Good sermon. Say the benediction and wrap this up because we need to go home." We're tired, we're hungry, they're tired, they're hungry. And Jesus says, you feed them. We don't have anything to feed them, Jesus. Send them home. Jesus says, are you sure about that? Have you checked to see what you have? They go back to the crowd. They come back to Jesus. We have 5 bread, 2 fish, and about 15,000 hungry people. Can we go home now? And Jesus says, and God, don't forget God. So he takes, he blesses, he breaks, he gives. Because that's what Jesus always does. He takes what we offer, he blesses what we give, he breaks it and shares it open with all who are in need. Well, actually, he gave the bread back to the disciples and told the disciples to give it to the people because God's provision and God's love flows through the disciples who follow Jesus. Now, we could get into all kinds of speculation at this point about matter and mass and multiplication and miracles to be explained or not explained. But you see, stories like this aren't about the how. This is a story about God, not about science. The story is talking about God's presence in the midst of exhausted people. It's a story about God's presence in the midst of hungry people. People who are hungry physically and hungry spiritually. So I would say the miracle of the story is in not the molecules of the yeast, but the lessons it teaches about God's provision and God's care and God's abundance and God's compassion and God's grace working through human hands. Mrs. Hughes was my 7th grade home economics teacher. For those of you too young to know, home economics was a class that the girls used to take to learn how to cook and sew, while the boys were in industrial arts learning how to hammer and saw. It was all very practical, if not a bit sexist. Nonetheless, Mrs. Hughes, if she said it once, she said it every day. You are what you eat. You are what you eat. Eat healthy and be healthy. Eat fat and figure it out. She wasn't Jewish, but she could have been, because the Jewish food laws pretty much said the same thing. You are what you eat. Eat pure and be pure. Eat unclean, you can figure it out. And so the Jewish food laws were very strict. Keeping a kosher kitchen was very important, and it was a very detailed process. It took a whole lot of effort. The whole process of preparing food had to be done just so. The utensils had to be kept separate so there was no cross-contamination. There's thousands of hungry people sitting down beside a lake. A stranger hands them some bread and fish. And you have to know that some of the first thoughts were, is it kosher? Who fixed it? Was the kitchen clean? Did you even wash your hands? Is it gluten-free? Can I eat it? According to the Jewish food laws, you didn't just eat anything, and particularly not anything that some stranger might have passed to you. And another Jewish food law was similar. Basically, it said you are who you eat with. Because when you ingest the same food with another person, you become one with that person. Those nutrients feed your cells the same way in your same body. And so you didn't just eat with just anybody. There were thousands of people sitting there. Some were Jewish. Many were not. Some were baptized. Many were not. They were different from one another. Some were clean and healthy, and some were diseased and sick. You are what you eat, and you are who you eat with. There's the miracle in the story. God was present in their exhaustion and in their fears and in their healing, and all ate together. And all were filled together. Racial and ethnic and economic and religious and political lines and divisions and barriers fell away, and all ate together, and all were filled together. Here we are 2,000 years later. We are still afraid. We are still in mourning. We are still exhausted, and we are still hungry, just like the disciples and just like the crowd. We are grieving a loss of innocence. We are grieving a simpler time. We are grieving the way it used to be, a sense of hopelessness. We're afraid. We're afraid there won't be enough. We're afraid there's not enough to go around. We're afraid we won't have enough money. We fear scarcity. We're afraid of the violence. It's all around us. We are afraid that they will win. Democrats and Republicans, I'm told, used to sit down to talk to one another, used to have conversations with one another, used to have opposing opinions and talk them out, and then go out to dinner together and sit at a table with one another. Who are you voting for? That's a question that seems too scary even to ask these days. If we don't already know the answer, the chances are that we would not bring that question up because we're afraid to be attacked, someone who thinks differently, afraid of a conversation. We're afraid to lose our rights, afraid to lose privileges, afraid to lose a voice, afraid we have no control, no way to affect change. And we live exhausted because of all that fear. And sometimes our to-do list looks like 5,000 hungry people waiting to be fed. There's a physical hunger in the world. There's a physical hunger in this land. People malnourished while our landfills are filled with food. But there's a spiritual hunger, a spiritual desire gnawing at our innards. And so we live in grief, in mourning, afraid, exhausted, and hungry. And Jesus says, you don't have to live that way. You don't have to live afraid, exhausted, and hungry anymore. We are what we eat, and we become what we eat, and we are who we eat with. And we certainly eat and nourish our body, and our Health Justice Committee would advise us to be mindful of what we put into our body. But we put a lot into our body besides the food, the thoughts and the images. We see thousands of images a day, a minute. We see and hear words that are spoken and sung and read. and those words become thoughts, and those thoughts become beliefs, and those beliefs become our actions. We are constantly feeding. We are constantly being fed and constantly absorbing all that is around us. And that might be the fears and the anxiety of the crowd. Constantly absorbing. It's easy to slip into this state of fear. And so we hear a story that reminds us that we can hear Jesus speaking calm in the midst of our exhaustion, in the midst of our fatigue and our hungers. Jesus speaks soothing words of encouragement. You feed them. You can do it. Look around. See all the resources there are. There's so much more than you think. There is enough for all. God is abundant, not scarce. You can find a group to sit with. You can find a group to share your story with. You can find a group to share with, to care with, to help one another with. You can find a group that will remind you that God's grace is poured out for all. We can come into this space and we can find community to remind us of these lessons of caring and sharing. We see this table every time we come in, and whether or not it's a particular Sunday that we're serving the bread and the juice and the communion, it is still here as a reminder that what is blessed and broken and shared is God's love, and it is poured out for all. Jesus doesn't leave people hungry, not physically and not spiritually. Jesus doesn't leave people emotionally exhausted. When we come together at this sacred community of God's people, we can be reminded and hear these stories where divisions fall away, where otherness is transcended into oneness, where we become one, gathered here and one in the community beyond, and one stretching even further. And so we share and we care and we breathe and we love, and we know that God is on this road with us. And the miracles are taking place right here, all around us, every day, every week, every year, because the miracle is God's love that flows to all. And there is enough. It is so. Amen.